Yeah, it's a great honour and a privilege for me to be here. I'm going to use my chair's privilege just to talk for 1 minute about Jeff, and then I'll pass over to Shelley. So I've known Jeff for about 15 years now. I think I met him, maybe 20 years, met him when I was making a BBC programme on the trolley problem, and went to visit him, and he took me down to see the Parfit suite in his house. And I don't think he's ever had a duty to help me, but if he has had a duty to help me, he's always gone beyond the call of duties. He's been fantastically helpful with my trolley book, thank you, Jeff, and of course incredibly helpful with my Parfit book, which I couldn't have written without him. I mean, you know that, of course, Jeff and Derek were very close, and they've got a number of things that they have in common. So both came to philosophy from another discipline. So Derek came to philosophy from history, and Jeff came from English literature, I think. They both have a reputation for being extremely generous with their students. I know Jeff had a 12-hour tutorial with Derek once, and I think he's passed that forward. They've got a very similar style of philosophy. I think they're kind of rigorous, logical, uncompromising. They're both revisionists in moral philosophy, so they both think that common sense gets some things wrong. But there are, of course, big differences between the two of them, and I think this is best summed up in their differing attitude to tea and coffee.
It was best summed up by the fact that Derek was 10 times smarter than I.
Well, anyway, back to caffeine. So Derek it was all about the caffeine because he wanted to save time. So he would sometimes just turn the hot water tap on to make his coffee, and sometimes if there's no hot water, he would just make his coffee with cold water. So Jeff has a completely opposite attitude to tea. So Jeff has his green tea. It's ordered from a special plantation. Water has to be brewed, I think, for 6 minutes with distilled water. I was speaking to a friend last week in London big fan of Jeff, who invited him for a conference, and he said Jeff arrived with his own kettle. Oh, there you go. It wasn't fake news. And, you know, I'm a great admirer, of course, of Derek, but I think in some ways Jeff gets life right. There's more to philosophy than life. There's green tea, for example. So, anyway, time to introduce our guests. Shelley doesn't need any introduction, of course. I did once write a newspaper profile of Shelley, and I can't remember much about it, but all I do remember is that he once applied to become a rabbi in a seminary and had been turned down. And so he went into philosophy, and I think I said then that God's loss was philosophy's gain. So, Shelley, take it away.
So 2 years ago this fall, there was a similar conference for Tom Herka on the occasion of his retirement. And the name of the paper I gave then was Herka on Comparative Dessert. Wrong, 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 and wrong. When Jeff got up to give his paper later, he said he had learned a lot from my talk. The most important thing was, don't invite him to my retirement. Unhappily for Jeff, he forgot his own advice. Here I am. Actually, I'm going to be less harsh on Jeff, because the stuff I want to talk about isn't so much he's committed himself to certain views, in print. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a thing that gets called, I gather, all I know about it is I learned from Jeff, two-tier views in population ethics. He gave a version of this paper at Larry Temkin's retirement conference. I then sent him a long email saying, is this what you're trying to say? Is that what you're trying to say? He wrote an even longer email in response saying, no, what about this? What about that? What have you? When I decided that was what I was going to try to think through for today, he sent me, and I asked him, do you have anything else? He sent me another 30-page document, just notes to himself. So what I'm going to be doing is reacting to my attempt to try to understand this view. And the advantages are None of you have read any of this material, so I can make up anything, and you're not in any position at all to say I've got him wrong. And when Jeff gets up and says you've got him wrong, we will all know he's just being defensive. Okay, so, and I know that there are other people who've written on subjects of views like this. I know Larry's got some stuff on this. Derek wrote on this. I think Mike has written. And I can just say, I haven't read any of those people. So I could just be simply reinventing the wheel. And I should also say, I'm not actually going to be defending two-tier views, nor am I going to be attacking two-tier views. My goal is simply trying to understand them and to think a little bit about the space of alternative possible views here. Okay, so to get started, I'm very low tech. I do not know what PowerPoint is, so you can all just continue staring at Jeff's lovely visage, but I'll occasionally draw something down here. So here's the initial thought. Imagine Adam could live a life of 80 years or could live a happy life of 60 years. Intuitively, both of these lives are good for Adam, sorry. Both of these lives are good for Adam. But we also have the intuition that the life of 80 years is better for him because it's got the 20 extra, happy years. And so far we're just, I mentioned most people have these intuitions. And then the thought behind the two-tier view is that when you focus on the 20 extra years, that it's better for him to have 20 more good years, those extra years should count more. They should count special. They have extra weight. In choosing between these two outcomes, we should give twice as much weight, however exactly we want to put it, to the fact that there's going to be 20 extra good years that way. And so there's the merely good for years. GF stands for good for, and BW stands for better or worse, because the life of 80 is 20 years better for Adam. The life of 60 is 20 years worse for Adam. So in my sloppitude, I'll call these the BW years. And the reason that you've got to give him the 80-year life has to do with the extra weight that the 20 BW years have in terms of creating an extra strong reason or something like that. In contrast, you've got the 60 years in both cases that are good for him. We could call those the merely good for years. And so the two-tier intuition is, well, you can see the two levels, right? There's the merely good for years of 6. You guys can't see anything. You can take my word for it, that there's the merely 60 good years, that's the tier. But then there's this extra tier up there of 20 extra years, the BW years, and those have extra weight. Jeff, merely for the sake of illustration, in some of the correspondence, and I think the initial paper, he thought if each good for a year counted for 1, then the BW years could count for 2 or something like that. Because you want to give extra weight in choosing one outcome by taking account of the fact that not just these things are good for the people, but if one outcome would be better for somebody or worse for somebody, that needs to really weigh more heavily. All right, so, and I basically just wanted to try to understand this view. I have some of the intuitions. I don't really believe the view, but I say my goal is not to criticize it, just to understand it. And really work out what it might look like. Just some simplifying assumptions. I've got 80 and 60 here. I'll normally use smaller numbers just to keep my math easier. I'll talk about years of 10 or 12 or something. Nothing's going to turn on that. It is important that you have to think of all these years as equally good, just for simplicity. To complicate it with lives of different value will just be complicated, and it's an unholy mess as it is. Probably the most important, and they're all equal, so the equally good years, and it's also worth saying that I want these to be thought of as purely good years, because there is an interesting question, which again in some of the correspondence Jeff notes to himself, he's not confident what to say about the intrinsic bad stuff. Maybe the same kind of differentiation shouldn't take place at all, or should work in a different way, and it would be just twice the talk to try to talk about how we're going to extend the view from the purely good cases to the more mixed cases. So we're just not going to go there, I hope. There are probably other simplifying assumptions I'm making. You might worry about whether, this came up earlier today, about whether you should give extra weight to actually existing people versus future people. Just try to disregard that. Try to imagine in all these cases, creation is what's happening. So nobody's actually existing yet. You might worry about whether these good for years also have impersonal value in addition to the good for value. And I'll just try to put that aside as well. All right. So, I've already tried to give you the basic intuition, but it comes out probably, if you draw a slightly different case, so you could have Adam at 10. You're trying to choose between two outcomes, and Adam at 8 versus Adam at 10, 10, Adam down here, and Eve at 8. So here's the thought. It's that intuitively, if you've got these kinds of intuitions at all, you're going to think it's a good thing if we create the world where Adam is at 10. He's got 10 good for years. It's a good thing, in this case over here. It's a good thing if you create the world where Eve exists instead. She's got 8 good for years. But it's better to create the world with Adam at 10 because there's more good for years. So this is the creating Adam in the Adam-Eve case is better by some amount because of the 2 extra good for years. But if you had to choose between creating Adam at 10 and creating Adam at 8, well, again, the same initial thing is true. It seems as though creating Adam at 10 is better than creating Adam at 8. It's also the case that there's 2 extra good for years, and so there's more good for value going around. But it's also the case that this outcome is better for Adam, because the alternative would have been which he only was at 8. And if he created Adam at 8, he'd have a kind of complaint. He could say, you could have created me at 10. And the thought's just supposed to be, this is the 2-tier thought, that has extra weight. And so, if we were going to calculate, this is the way that Jeff typically seems to do it in this correspondence. If you give 1 point to each good for year, then this is a 10. Over here, creating Eve, that's an 8. The difference, why is it better to create Adam at 10? 10 minus 8 is 2. So the advantage here, is 2. Whereas if we do the 2-tier idea, then we've got the 8 good for years in both cases. So they both get 8 points. Here, again, this is how Jeff does it. He says, okay, but if you pick Adam at 10, in addition to having the 8 good for years, there's 2 better years. And let's count that twice as much. So that's 2 times 2 makes 4, plus the 8 makes 12. 12 versus 8, so this is better by 4. Okay, so that's supposed to capture the intuition. The math is just a way of, representing the intuition that although it's better in both cases you create Adam at 10, it's more better to create Adam in this case at 10 than it is to create Adam in that case at 10. Okay. Obviously, having a count for 2, that's just an arbitrary thing to illustrate it. And if we really tried to work it through, you'd want to worry about how much weight does it have vis-a-vis one thing versus the other. Nothing I'm going to say is going to really turn on that, although I am going to worry about some of the ways that Jeff is capturing this thought. So one thing to notice is that, in fact, the way I just ran it was that what we did was we added some extra points to Adam at 10 in this scenario to capture the fact that that's better for him, or the 2 better worse BW years, and that counts twice as much. But of course, we also could notice that if we were to create 8, then instead of it being the case that Adam's got this, we need a piece of vocabulary. I'll come back to the vocabulary in a second. So suppose we created Adam at 8, then Adam would have a kind of complaint, right? He'd say, you could have created me at 10. And in all these cases, just imagine that there's nothing otherwise forbidding or requiring any of these choices, and it's all cost-free. And so we're all just worried about the value of the various outcomes. Adam will have a kind of complaint. Whereas, we need a word for if we pick Adam at 10, then he's got grounds for gratitude. So he has Yeah, we need a word here, right? He has a, right? I'm going to use the word, what was the word you were suggesting? What? An anti-complaint? That's an ugly word. You thought that was ugly. Wait till you hear what I'm going to use. So it's just like, he has a complaint, and so he has a complaint. I'm going to say if he's got grounds for gratitude, he has a grat. Okay? All right. So what Jeff does is he adds value or points or, enhances the score of picking the 10. He adds for the grats, right? And then you might ask, okay, that's interesting. Suppose we picked 8, then Adam would have had a complaint. Jeff doesn't subtract for the complaint. The value of this thing was supposed to be 8 for the GF years plus 2 times 2 for the BW for the grat. So that was 8 plus 4 equals 12. But Jeff does not say, okay, 8 minus, well, now you've got to take away for the complaint. It's give it the same weight. You've got 2 years of complaint times 2. That would take away 4. So this could have been 8 minus 4 equals 4 net. And then the difference is, 8, not a mere difference of 4. Jeff doesn't subtract. Jeff doesn't subtract for complaints. He adds for grats. And then the obvious thing to ask is, well, that's interesting. Why? Why not subtract instead of adding? And so here's an immediately, obviously natural, comforting philosophical thought. It doesn't matter whether we add or subtract. I mean, you've got to get different numbers, of course, but the rankings, here the comforting thought is it won't affect the rankings any if you subtract instead of adding. And that's a very comforting thought. It just turns out that it's false, as comforting thoughts often are. I will spare you all the example. I'll keep making totally unsubstantiated claims about this makes a difference, this makes a difference, this makes a difference. I won't actually give you the examples that show you that it makes a difference. Leave that as an exercise for the audience. But yes, if we subtracted instead of adding, maybe in this case it wouldn't make a difference, but in other cases it would make a difference. And so there's the obvious question. Why add instead of subtract? Why not subtract instead of adding? And you might wonder, is there some deep philosophical reason for doing this? And I'll come back to that later with some, I don't think altogether successful arguments that I will completely unfairly ascribe to Jeff. The unsuccessful arguments for why you should add rather than subtracting. Another possibility is, and you might have some, metaphysical view about the nature of ethics, meta-ethics or something like that. You might think that there are people who seem to think this, that what ethics is all about is avoiding objections to what you've done. Right? And then you might think, if that's what ethics is really about, what we should do is subtract for complaints. You shouldn't add for, grats. You should subtract only, but not add only. And of course, once you say that you can subtract as well as add, you might ask, why not do both? Why not both add and subtract? After all, here's something that enhances the value of Adam at 10. He's got a grat. Here's something that reduces intuitively the value of Adam at 8. He's got a complaint. Why not do both? Now, one might object, over lunch at this conference for Larry, when Jeff gave this, I was discussing with people after his talk, and people said, doing both would be double counting. And I suppose, in some sense, it would be double counting. It would be double counting the years, but it's under different guises, right? The fact that you've given him a 10, Adam's got something extra to be grateful for. Well, that seems like that would be a morally significant thing to give some extra weight to if you're in a 2-tier mood at all. And similarly, if we give him 8, Jeff, it looks like Adam's got a complaint, and so why not just do both? I don't see what the force of the double counting is. Now, a complaint. Now, you might worry, that's going to give too much weight on the whole to the significance of the better-worse years. And that's why you should only do one versus the other. Of course, if that's true, you got a problem because you need an argument for doing one versus the other because it's going to give you a difference to some outcomes. But if your worry was just about giving things too much weight, then just cut it in half. Give each of them half as much extra weight as you otherwise would have been inclined to do. Then the sum total weight to the outcome influencing the rankings would be the same total as if you'd only done one versus the other. In fact, that then suggests an even more general type of question. Let's see if I can manage to remember what my diagram is supposed to look like. Zero, this is 100%. This is 100%. That's 0. You could have, if this was, let's say, complaints, this was down here, this was grats. It gave me a box of markers. 3 of them are worn out. Corpus Christi needs to buy some new markers. Right, so going half is say, imagine the total amount of weight you wanted to give to the significance of the top tier, the better, worse years. Cutting them in half, doing it all in Jeff's way, addition only is basically giving all the weight you wanted to give to the grats. Doing it complaints only is giving all the weight to the complaints. Doing it both half and half is in the middle. But obviously, once you start drawing a diagram like this, you can see there's a lot of other possibilities, right? You might think maybe complaints are a much more significant thing than grats. And so we'd have something, in this vicinity, but that doesn't mean the grats don't count at all, right? And so there's really, strictly speaking, it's an infinite range, but there's a huge range of different positions here. And if any two-tier theorist is going to take a stance on this, they're going to need to give us some story about why doing it one way rather than another. What's next? Let's see. All right, different point. Let's see, there's a previous page. Got this. Yeah, let's go with this one. So there's a way that I've been talking that suggests a certain picture. And that picture is, there's the reason, there's the one point you get for each good for year, for the merely good for years. And then there's the 2 points you get with regard to the better, worse years. And that suggests, if we put aside this, that when we're thinking about the better, worse years, there's one reason that comes into play. It's an especially weighty reason. It's got a weight of 2, as opposed to the reason that comes into play down here. But for this level, or this layer, or this tier, there's a single reason. There's the fact that it would be better for you, or the fact that it would be worse for you, and that's 2. And so I call this the 1R approach, for one reason. And at least typically in Jeff's, the correspondence, it seems to me that was the way he talked. I suspect that that's not the most philosophically perspicuous way to think about the position. Because the idea is supposed to be that the fact that a given year is good for you, good for Adam, good for whoever it might be, good for Eve, good for Jeff, gives you a reason. These are the merely good for years. But all 80 years are good for Adam. And so if the fact that a year would be good for somebody gives you some reason to pick that alternative, then that reason should extend all the way. That should really be what the good for position looks like. And so there's an extra reason that comes into play when we're talking about the better, worse years. So there's the good for is throughout. The good for reason is there throughout. The better, worse reason is there only for the extra years. And so there's really 2 reasons that come into play when we're talking about the better, worse years. So I call that the 2R view. And I don't know that Jeff is actually committed to the truth of the 1R view. It's not like in any of the correspondence, we distinguish between this. And he said, oh, no, the way to go is 1R, not 2R. There were passages that I thought suggested to my ear that he was thinking in 1R terms. Jonas helpfully pointed out in one of his comments that I don't think you're planning to say, so I hope I'm not usurping anything, that quote all by itself can be read, and that's all completely fair. This is why I don't do the history of philosophy. I hate trying to actually what anybody other than me meant by anything. And so I don't really know for sure whether Jeff is a 2R theorist or a 1R theorist. Truth of the matter is you're going to get the same result. If you think that the GF counts for 1, and the better worse counts for 1, then when you're a 2R theorist, each of those years is going to count for 2 net, and that's all that Jeff's really, for the sake of illustration, committing himself to. And so it's possible that the reason, as an addition-only theorist, it's possible that the reason he doesn't distinguish is because it won't really make any difference whether you are a 2R theorist or a 1R theorist if you are addition-only. If you let subtraction into the picture, then it does make a difference because, as a 1R theorist, you're going to say, okay, if we gave, Adam whatever was 60, we have to subtract 2 points instead of, whereas if you're a 2R theorist, you're only going to subtract 1 point. If you're a 1R theorist, he's not getting any extra points for the extra 20 years here. If you're a 2R theorist, he gets that point and then loses a point, so it kind of, nullifies itself, blah, 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 right? The point is just whether you're a 2R theorist or a 1R theorist will matter once we let subtraction in. Whether we do only subtraction or we do both. Jeff's an addition-only theorist, at least that's how I read him. In fact, he has some arguments against subtraction. All right, so that's, I think it's philosophically more perspicuous to be a 2R theorist. And that's going to have its answers, not just as a more perspicuous, it's going to have implications in terms of how the math is going to come out in other sorts of examples. All right, what's next? Let's see. Oh, yeah, I guess this is the same point, just slightly different. Jeff sometimes talks as though what we're doing is multiplying. We are when we're taking the better, worse cases, points and years into account, what we do is we take each year and we multiply it by 2. And that's harmless if you're an addition-only theorist. But for the reasons that I was just suggesting, it's not really a perspicuous way. In fact, it's going to just kind of be a philosophical dead end if you are a 2R theorist and you're allowing for subtraction. Because indeed, one of Jeff's worries about how to handle subtraction, because he's thinking in terms of multiplication, is, okay, so if we were going to subtract for complaints, since for grats, what we do is we take each year and we multiply to something bigger than 1. Okay, so for complaints, what we'd have to do is take each year that was worse for you and multiply by something less than 1, maybe a half or something like that. And then this just leads to weirdnesses all over. Do you multiply all 60 years by a half? That seems wrong. Do you multiply only those 20 years? Those 20 years aren't there. What do you multiply? But this is just to say we shouldn't be thinking of this in terms of multiplication at all. We should be thinking about the extra points that you get for being better for somebody and the extra points you lose, assuming that we allow for both, if you subtract. So it's not multiplication at either side, it's addition in both. It'll be mathematically equivalent if we're addition-only theorists, but it'll still be philosophically misleading, but if we are open to having subtraction, let alone doing both, then you're going to want to think in terms of adding and subtracting rather than multiplying. Here are some other questions that we need to think about in thinking about two-R views, two-tier views. So imagine that what you're doing is you're adding an extra point for each better or worse year, or maybe subtracting an extra point for each a better or worse year on the complaint side. Is it in fact 1 point, supposing again that's just arbitrary, is it 1 point extra per year? That is, does the moral significance of the grats or the complaints, does it increase linearly? So that if you double the size of the grat, had twice as many purely good years, equally good purely good years, does that add twice as many points? And again, as far as I can see, it's not that Jeff ever in the correspondence says, yes, I've thought about this issue, and all I'm really doing is making work for Jeff in his retirement. It isn't, yes, I've thought about it, and it should be linear. As far as I can see, I didn't notice any discussion of it. And so I just want to say, here's a question. Should it be linear or not? Or should the significance of grats and complaints vary in a kind of exponential, nonlinear fashion? Just as a loose analogy, for those of you who think about moderate deontology, where you have a right not to be harmed, so there's a deontological constraint against harming people. If you're a moderate, you think that these things have thresholds. If there's enough good at stake, it becomes permissible to harm somebody. The more the harm, the higher the threshold. But not all modern deontologists think that the threshold increases linearly. You might think double the amount of harm and you need to more than double the amount of good. Well, then similarly, you might think if grats and complaints have a kind of moral weight, we shouldn't take it for granted that that weight varies linearly. Maybe it varies in a nonlinear fashion. All I wanted to just throw out the question. A different issue, again, just questions, what's next on my list? A different question is this. Suppose that we've got a slightly more complicated case. All my cases are pretty Mickey Mouse, where I didn't even need probably to draw this, but I'll do it anyway. So Adam could be created at 5 or at 8 or at 10. I don't know why I put the 5 down there, but there it is. All right, so look, intuitively, if you give him 8, then he's got a complaint vis-a-vis the 10. He's got a grat vis-a-vis the 5. Suppose you create him at, actually, I'll do a different point first. So in thinking about these choices, and trying to compare how good for this choice, how good for this choice, how much reason do I have to pick this world or that world, do we do this pairwise? Do I look at the 8 and compare it first to the 5 and say, there's a grat of 3, and so that's going to enhance the value of the 8. But then when I'm comparing the 8 to the 10, there is no grat anymore. There's just the complaint of 2. And so the value of thinking about any given outcome, if you're doing it pairwise, is going to differ and vary depending on what you're comparing it to. The fact that it's comparative, that's not meant to be any kind of objection here. I mean, this whole approach, if you're thinking in a two-tier thought, is this better or worse than some other outcome, is basically saying the value of the outcome or the reasons we have to pick the outcome are in part not just a matter of the intrinsic nature of that alternative, but a comparative to what other alternatives were. And so the value of the outcome here is not limited to the intrinsic features of the outcome. That's not anything that bothers me. I know it would drive G.E. Moore crazy, but it doesn't bother me at all. But it is also the case that if you do these things pairwise, and so you gain the grat, you lose the grat, you've got a complaint, you lose the complaint, what have you. It does mean that if that's the way we start evaluating things, and so when we're evaluating the 10, we have to get one comparison, 10 vis-a-vis 8, different comparison, 10 vis-a-vis 5. In this example, you won't get it, but in other examples, those sort of pairwise approaches will lead to intransitive rankings. And again, I just will spare you the gory details of showing that. Take my word for it. So it'll lead to intransitive rankings. Now Larry Temkin wrote a very long book saying we should not be bothered by intransitive rankings. We all know he's wrong. Actually, I mean, I think that what the official thesis of the book was. There's a lot of value claims you want to make that you won't be able to make if you insist on transitivity, you should be open to the possibility. Is that a fair appraisal of the thesis of the book? Fair enough, he says, yeah. So you should be open to giving up transitivity. So I think he's right. We should be open to it, and then having considered it, we should decide to keep transitivity. In a high-handed fashion, I'm just going to throw away pairwise and say what we should do is global. But of course, that's just one more choice point in a two-tier theory. In thinking about these things, you take into account the entire choice set. You say, aha, 8's got in evaluating it both the grat that it's 3 better than 5 and the complaint that it's 2 worse than the 10. The 10, takes into account not just the fact that it's 2 better than the 8, but it actually takes into account the fact that it's 5 better than the 5, and so we should be global about this. Okay. So once we're being global, then a different question arises. So look, I just said, in measuring the size of the grat for the 10, do we simply jump over the 8 and say, the 10 is 5 better than the 5, and so he's got a grat of 5. And are we just going to neglect the fact that compared to the 8, he's got a grat of 2? Do we look for, as it were, the biggest possible grat in this choice set? And from 5's point of view, he's got a complaint of 5 vis-a-vis the 10. It's irrelevant that he's lower than 3 compared to the 8. Should we pick the singleton in this way, or should we go multiples? And my view is, I'm prepared to hear an argument, but I don't see why we shouldn't go with multiples. Why we shouldn't say, look, if you pick 5, he's got 2 things to complain about. He said, he could say, you could have given me 10, but at least you could have given me 8. That seems intuitively, relevant in terms of how much he's got to complain about. And similarly, in terms of Adam at 10, he should say, not only should he be grateful, that he's got 5, but, you could have stopped at 8. You gave me the full thing, right? So I'm inclined to think, I don't see why you wouldn't want to go for multiples as well as instead of singletons. And again, that's just going to affect the math. In ways, so we're going to need some sort of argument as to why we should go one way versus the other. All right, and now for something completely different. Look, in the cases I've been talking about, there have been no cases where Adam didn't exist. Well, I mean, the earlier Adam-Eve case, there was that, but I wasn't really talking about that. If you were to throw in, I'm going to use just n for non-existence. If you were to, I should have had it down here, but if you were to throw in an n, a non-existence alternative, it wouldn't affect any of the math. All the questions that we would have still had would still be there. Should we be multiple? Are we pairwise? Are we global? Whatever it might be. But intuitively, at least I think a fair number of people have the intuition that, look, if we introduce as one of the live alternatives Adam not existing, then Adam's existing at all is, we just need a term, I'll use the word fragile. Adam's existence is fragile. And so all of these good 4 years are fragile. They wouldn't be there were you to have picked the, right. In contrast, if we cross off the non-existence alternative again, where, you may be creating Adam, but your alternatives are limited to ones in which he exists, then Adam's existence is robust. And so similarly, we could talk about the robustness versus the fragility of the good 4 years and the good 4 reasons, and the robustness versus the fragility of the complaints and the grats and so forth and so on. I imagine there is nobody here who isn't familiar with, because who would come to a conference like this if you weren't familiar with the Narvisonian thought? I will not get it exactly right, so you'll forgive me for this. But that we should make people happier. We shouldn't make happy people, right? Now, I take it that thought is saying, at least in part, that if you had a choice between, let's say, Adam not existing at all versus Adam existing at, let's say, 10, you have no reason at all to create Adam at 10. I take it that's at least part of what Narvison is meaning to be expressing with that thought. It's been, 40 years since I've read Narveson, so don't quote me on this, but I take it that's part of what he's got in mind. Anybody who's drawn to the two-tier theory, as I've been trying to spell it out, is going to need to reject that thought, is rejecting that thought, because after all, if your choices are between atom at nothing versus atom at 10, well, there's no grat. This is a point I should have said half an hour ago. This is the problem about chatting instead of looking. You forget points, but now I remember you should have said this. So in all this talk about better and worse, Jeff thinks that if you pick atom at 10 as opposed to non-existence, although the 10 years are good for atom, they're not better for atom. Why aren't they better? Because Jeff, former English major, thinks better than is a comparative, and to have that comparative be legitimate, you've got to say that the non-existence would be worse for atom, but atom wouldn't exist in the non-existence scenario, so it can't be worse for him. But if it can't be worse for him, then if it's 10 years, it can't be better for him. He's acknowledging there's something good there. That's why he likes the language of good for, but he doesn't like the language of better or worse when you compare it to a non-existence alternative. For whatever it's worth, I was not an English major. I have a very tin ear. I don't hear it at all. It seems to me if one outcome is good for the person and the other outcome is not good for the person, then the first outcome is better for the person. That's just what me and my stupidity, English as my native language tells me. But I don't care, because all of this is just supposed to be in the spirit of Jeffitude. Right, and so I'm not going to challenge any of that. I hope I haven't said anything incompatible with that yet. Okay, and so, but you might think, okay, so nothing versus 10. What you're going to say is, okay, the 10 is good for him. That you got a reason to create it. It gives you 10 points. So that's a rejection to Narvesonian thought. But you might think we should accept a neo-Narvesonian thought or a semi-Narvesonian thought. You might think in the case when the good 4 years are fragile, instead of counting for full weight, the 1, maybe they should count for a little bit less. And again, just arbitrarily, I'll call it 2/3 and say, okay, so maybe a fragile good year counts for 2/3 of a point, whereas a robust good year counts for a full year, for a full point. And once you start thinking this thought, you might wonder, oh, okay, why not do the same thing for the complaints and the grats? Imagine that you could have nothing, non-existence, or 8, or 10 for atom, and you create him at 8, and he starts complaining to you, you could have created me at 10. I think some people have the intuition where we could say, you know what, I didn't have to create you at all, buddy. You got nothing to complain about. You might think, well, maybe you have something to complain about, but you have less to complain about. And so whatever weight you were prepared to give to ordinary complaints, give them, in the robust case, give them less weight in the fragile case. Should we say the same thing about, actually, I think there's something you were going to talk about, so I have to throw something in. So I think that's not a very compelling point, because after all, if the alternative wasn't non-existent for atom, but 0.1, you might think he would still have less to complain about. Shut up, buddy, I could have created you at 0.1. But there is this, by Jeff's lights, a grat that you gave me, 8 or 7.9 instead of 0.1. So that offsets the complaint, and so we might get the same net effect. But in the n versus 8-10 case, if you create him at 8, there is no grat there to be offsetting. So if you do think his complaint is weaker in that case, I think you've got to say, yeah, you don't gotta, but a plausible thing to say is, okay, that's weaker as well. You might wonder whether the same thing should hold on the grats side. I think I was saying grats now, but I meant complaints. You might wonder whether grats should also be reduced. That's a little bit weird, because if you start saying, oh, you created me at 10 instead of 8, and it could have been created at nothing. You could have created me at nothing. I'm so grateful. We say, well, yeah, you shouldn't be so grateful, because it could have created you not at all. That rings very, very hollow. And so it seems as though, if anything, the grat gets value enhanced rather than diminished, which would be an interesting asymmetry if it's true. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap up very, very quickly. I want to just say one other quickly thing about, back to the issue about subtraction. Is there anything bad about subtraction? Well, let me just give you one argument that I think sometimes Jeff gives, or at least I think maybe he's tempted by. If you're going to assign value to things, you've got to point to what's there. And in the case of the extra years, there's something there to point to. That's the bearer of the extra value. But in the case of the absence, in the case of the supposed complaint, you've got nothing to point to. There's no missing years there to be the bearer, right? Absences can't be the bearers of value. Yeah, I think at least I suspect Jeff being tempted by that. But I think that's a mistaken picture, because the real thought of what's going on is there's just a certain number of years, and there's a certain other number of years. And there's the non-comparative fact about how much good for stuff there is, and the non-comparative stuff about how much good for stuff there is. And then there's the comparative fact. This is bigger than that. That gives you extra value here. But then there's also the comparative fact. This is smaller than that. That gives you possibly grounds for diminishing value. All of which is just to say, if there is a good argument for doing addition only rather than subtraction, I don't yet know what it is. But as I say, my point here wasn't to take for a particular argument. It was just somehow to point out, to work through what might two-tier views look like, and to just point out there's a whole lot of them, and conceivably, we shouldn't even be two-tier theorists. If what I was talking about versus fragility versus robustness is right, we should perhaps be four-tier theorists. All right, thank you.
Great questions. There's one here.
Thanks. So I just wanted to ask about the multiple complaints versus the kind of single complaint that jumps over the top, if you like. So I think this picks up on some of what the response said, but it just seems to be an odd way to think about complaints if we take it out of this context. It's an odd way to think about complaints that the kind of number of in-between steps makes a difference to the strength of my complaint. So if Helen knocks over my tea, I might have a complaint about that, but it seems odd to think that I would kind of have an extra complaint if she might have kind of spilled half of it, right? So I say, oh, look, not only have you spilled all of my tea, you've also spilled the bottom half as well. And so it looks like there's a double counting there. And then if we think about this in terms of moral complaints, if I can kill Jeff, it looks like he might have a complaint about that, although, we'll see. But then, he doesn't get an extra complaint about my killing him if I could also have, just chopped off one of his legs, right? And I say, and he says, well, look, not only did you, kill me and that's made me worse off than I would otherwise have been, you've also killed me and made me worse off than I would have been had you just chopped off one of my legs. That seems an odd way to think about complaints, just generally.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example, right? So I don't know what to say quite in response, so I'll pretend I do have something to say. So one is, and it's, if indeed you had it completely open to you to do anything along the spectrum, then you'd have an infinite number of complaints, and that would make the math go insane. So we better not do that. I don't know what to say, why you should allow it in the discrete case, but not in the spectrum case or the continuum case. So nice point. On the other hand, we do of course think that, look, not only did you spill my tea, but you did this other bad thing as well. And we don't say, oh, you get to only offer one complaint. If you figure out your biggest complaint is then you're out. That doesn't seem right either. So at least it just seems to me, I don't know, we got to think harder about this.
Right, and this looks closer to the tea example than some completely alternative.
That's right.
Can you pass it to Tom? We'll have to keep the questions pretty short because we've only got 20 minutes. So,
okay, I'll try to be short. I was trying to think of an example where subtraction matters. So maybe you could comment on the following case. I could either create Adam at 10, Adam at 8, or Eve at 7. Now, if there's just addition, then the best thing is to create Adam at 10. The second best is to create Adam at 8. The third best is to create Eve at 7. But if there was subtraction, then Adam at 8 would go down to 6, and that would now be the worst thing, and creating Eve would be the second best thing. Anyways, is that an example that's worth thinking about?
Well, it's worth
Adam at 10, Adam at 8, Eve at 7.
It's worth thinking about, but I think you might say it's not taking seriously, I'll try to inhabit this position, it's not taking seriously the thought that there's something objectionable if I've created you in a situation where I could have done something better for you. If you take that thought seriously, then you might say, yeah, it may seem initially in our naivete weird to think that 8 would be worse than Eve at 7, Adam at 8 would be worse than Eve at 7, but after all, Eve at 7 has no complaint. This is an objection-free moral world, whereas if you create 8, there's an objection there. Now, if you find that answer unacceptable, it might just be that you're not sympathetic to the view, and then I've got sympathy for not being sympathetic to the view. But I don't see why one shouldn't think, when somebody's got a complaint, that's worse. And if it's enough to outweigh things, I mean, it's like, just one other quick analogy, it's a little bit like saying, how can you be a strict egalitarian? You know, leveling down is bad for everybody. And the answer is, if you're drawn to thinking equality matters, then there's a way in which it's better. So if you're drawn to thinking complaints matter, then yeah, that's the thought.
I wasn't making an objection. I was just asking whether that would be the right verdict in that case.
Oh, depending on the weights, but in principle, sure.
That if you don't subtract, then creating Adam at 8 is second best. If you do subtract, creating Adam at 8 is third best.
It depends on how much weight you give for the subtraction. But you're right. It could turn out that creating Adam at 8 is the worst thing. That's an implication. Whether one finds that objectionable might just be a reflection of whether or not you think complaints really speak against, there being something morally objectionable about an outcome might be grounds for not selecting it.
Quick one from Victor, and we've got Larry and the person next to Larry up there.
Hi, thanks very much. That was fascinating. So I take it you don't think that complaints are fundamental morally, or that gratitude is fundamental morally, because it's the things we're grateful for or complain about that seem to matter. But then I wondered what the best version of the story was for someone like Jeff if you didn't think that complaints and gratitude were fundamental. Because I guess the way to resolve these things about whether complaints and grats matter is to give a story about what these things really are, complaints and grats that we're tracking, given that these complaints and grats are just the upshot of the things that really matter, but you didn't tell us anything about what really matters.
Right. So if I had used my time wisely in the opening part of my talk, I had left some time when I ran out of time to say, here are some arguments I ascribe to Jeff based on passing remarks he makes, right? At one point Jeff said in one of these notes something like, he doesn't have the word grats, but I'll paraphrase, complaints are merely the absence of a grat. And if that's right, then you might think, oh, well, then grats, you should have addition and complaints. Right. But of course, a subtraction-only theorist would just say the reverse. Johann, I think, is a complaints-only theorist. And so, Johann would just say, well, grats, they're just the absence of a complaint, right? So that's just tell us how you vote, right? So what one wants is an argument. And there's also another passage where Jeff says something like, look, imagine the case, you could create Adam at 4 or Adam at 10, and you create him at 4. Okay, so that's a complaint of 6. That gives you a score of -2. 4 minus 6 is -2. How could a life be there? But again, I think that's just not taken seriously, the thought that complaints give you reasons to not pick things. And they may be reasons that are powerful enough. So yes, I'm all ears to hear Jeff get up, at the end and tell us, here's why we should be addition-only theorists. My best guess was this kind of metaphysical picture, there's got to be a bearer of value. But then I think the answer to that is, yes, the 8 years, as opposed to the 10 years, are the bearer of the negative value because they have a comparative feature. I don't know any better argument.
Thanks very much. I have the worst possible kind of comment here, which is if anyone's actually interested in this topic, I have a paper on it that rehearses many of these kinds of views, but I will just add this. I do think that it's even more complicated than you suggest. You're talking about non-existence. Someone there raised the issue of you could bring people into existence and you could harm them. So as you hinted at one point, you bring someone at level 6, you could have brought them into 1,000, and then you say to them, but look, it could have been so much worse. I could have enslaved you and tortured you and all this sort of stuff. There's no end to those. I will endorse the thought that there's a temptation. When I first wrote on these topics, I just had a very simple view. It was a complaints view. I just looked upwards, and I looked at the highest complaint. So all the possible worlds I might be in, look at me compared to how I am in the world you created. The best one, that's the size of my person-affecting complaint. Jake Ross wrote a brilliant paper that showed me that won't work. So then you have to start thinking, if that won't work, and you still care about this kind of position, what might? And then all these things come into play, including a factor you didn't mention as well. There's the possible impact of the size of person-affecting complaints that other people might have in the alternatives in which you exist that could impact how strong we take your complaint. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. But so I endorse it. It's incredibly complicated. You think there's simple ways you might do it. There are strong, convincing examples against those. So then you have to open it up, and it's very complicated very quickly.
Yeah, so here's, of course, what I think, which is any simple view is not going to work. The view is going to get more and more complicated. Complication per se may not be an objection, but I just suspect there won't be any way to make views like this work at all, and one should just give it up. But one shouldn't give it up until one's explored it adequately, and so one needs to have a sense of the space.
One of the reasons I remember that I was motivated to go to addition only was that I was working with Derek's arguments and On What Matters, in which he's attacking two-tier views. And in the cases that he reviews, he always uses subtraction only. And he kept ending up, or one could end up, with his were years of life. And with the discounting, subtracting, and so on, he could end up with cases in which, in a certain outcome, you would have people with negative years of life. That is, somebody who not only never existed, but had these negative years of life. And just made no sense.
A non-existent person has negative years? It's not really that an existent person has them?
No, it's just if you're looking at the outcomes and you do the discounting and so on, and if you choose this option, the result is that somebody doesn't exist for a certain number of years and nobody else ever exists. It's like you get 3 years of non-existence or something, which made no sense. That was one of the reasons.
Thanks. I think my thought is quite similar to what Jeff just said, but maybe try to kind of defend it a little bit. My thought is there is an argument against subtraction, which is think about a case in which you can either not create a person, create them at a very low level, 1 year, or create it at 10. If you say the fact that you have a complaint, if you create it at 1, is a reason not to create them, might mean that if someone says, I'm not going to create it at 10, should I create it at 1? Given that 1 year is still a good life, you want to say it's still permissible. But if you do subtraction, I think that's, you might actually get around that if you do multiplication, you can times it by, 0.5 or 0.1 or whatever, you can still get some reason. But if you do subtraction, it might be that now there's a reason not to create someone with a life worth living, given that you can create them with a higher level well-being. I think we might want to avoid that. I think that might be a reason to avoid subtraction.
I'm not sure if I've got the question, because if I have got it, it's something I've already spoken to. So maybe I just wasn't clear, or maybe I just haven't got what you're worried about. It's true that if you could create somebody at 10 who creates them at 1, and you create them at 1, if you're going to do subtraction rather than multiplying by a fraction, or something like that, then you can end up with a negative number. It's important not to construe that negative number as meaning this person has a life not worth living, or they had negative years, or something like that. No, that's just conflating the two categories of morally relevant consideration. This person had a life worth living at 1, that counts for something, but this person has a complaint. And if the complaint is big enough, it just outweighs the positive.
Yeah, so sorry, I guess my question is just, is it possible that that complaint can make it a case that you ought not to create that at 1?
Yeah,
when you're not
absolutely. I mean, just like, if you thought it's not that complaints are necessarily the only thing in ethics, but avoiding situations with morally objectionable features is important, then you might think it's worth having nobody if the only alternative is And this sort of idea can show up other places, right? I mean, again, you might just think, oh, this is why we should all go running to only person affecting values or something like that. But you might think people deserve to have a certain minimum level of well-being. And there are levels of existence that are positive, but below that level. And then there's a kind of injustice, a violation of people getting what they deserve. And you might think that just outweighs the positive value. Various kinds of critical level views work like this. And so I'm not saying these views are right. It's just that a view like this should be open to it. So we're going to need some other argument, I think, than just it can't possibly be that it's wrong on balance to create somebody with a life worth living.
Oh yeah, thanks. So this is really, I think, might just be a footnote to Larry's point, or Larry's comment. But I think in thinking about two-tier views, it would help to think about how lives with positive value compared to lives with negative value. And maybe this is just a comment for Jeff. So let's go back to Tom's case, which he introduced to raise the point that subtraction, whether you go for subtraction rather than addition, can make a difference. So you had this case, you could create Adam at 10, Adam at 8, or Eve at 7, and it might turn out that if we do subtraction but not addition, Adam at 8 is the worst outcome. Now, you might think that's counterintuitive, but as you said, maybe you're just not taking seriously the idea that people have complaints, right? But we could have done a case like this. We can create Adam at 1,000, Adam at 8, or Eve at -20, right? But they're just a horrible life. And it might turn out, depending on how we do the subtraction, that Adam at 8 is the worst outcome, and therefore it's worse to create a person with a good life than to create a different person with a bad life, which seems to violate what some would consider an adequacy condition on any theories of population. And maybe that's not true. Now, you could again say you're just not taking seriously the idea of people, and I think my answer would be, yeah, I'm not going to take it seriously anymore. Now, that might be an argument for going for addition, but if you do addition, again, depending on the details, you can actually get the same result. So, we can imagine a case, you create Adam at -1, Adam at -1,000, or Eve at 10. Right? Now, we might say that this outcome where Adam has -1 is actually really good because he's a lot better off than he could have been, right? But then again, and it could be even better than Eve at 10. And then again, we would have a kind of sadistic conclusion. Now, I'm not saying that either version of the view is committed to that, but I think we should think more about those cases because we might want to modify it in certain ways. We might want to say, well, the view doesn't really apply when you've got the cases, when you're comparing lives with negative welfare with lives with positive welfare or something like that. Yeah, so I can barely see you because of the stage lighting, blah, 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 blah. Sorry, Jeff, were you the commentator earlier who did the, right? So not surprising move for you to make. I'm not saying it's an illegitimate move, but it's worth noting. And I think it's probably for considerations like this that Jeff says in these mysterious manuscripts that I've alluded to earlier, that he just doesn't think it's obvious that you should carry out the same kind of view in this symmetrical fashion with regard to intrinsic bads. And I think those questions are so deep and so difficult that I simply wanted to sidestep them. But that's not to mean the problem's going to go away. It just means even more work needs to be done to avoid the kind of conclusion that you just gave. Yeah.
So I guess I'm just kind of puzzled by the whole discussion, and I'll try to be really quick about it. But it seems to me like there's one kind of question, which is, what do you do if you have people who are existing? And it's better to have Adam at 8. It's better to have Adam at 10 than Adam at 8. Better to have Adam at -1 than Adam at -1,000, etc. It's a whole other question if you're going to start considering people who may or may not exist. And it feels to me like, in some sense, you need this kind of two-tiered view if you're going to have weak non-parity, which Jeff does want to have, right? If you're going to have some way of saying, how much do we sacrifice among the people who exist in order to make it likely that other people will come into existence with valuable lives? But it also seems to me like those comparative questions really only arise in that comparative context. And you've been dealing with this mathematics in a way that just strikes me as, bizarre. I don't know. If you don't have.
You meant that as a criticism, right?
I did.
Because I don't hear it that way. Yeah.
No, but sorry. It's just a comment. There's no question there. But
Well, look, I mean, I can't remember the exact phrase you used, but like, what kind of sacrifices should one generation make so as to bring another generation, into existence and so forth. Of course, once you start looking at it that way, then you're going to have questions about what kinds of obligations do people have to make sacrifices, for futures, right? Which is a potentially distinct set of questions, because you could look at the kinds of questions that we've been talking about, not a matter of they're making sacrifices, we're simply giving them less. That is what happens if you give Adam 8 as opposed to 10, but then bring Eve into existence, at 7 or whatever it might be as well, right? And so the language of sacrifice may be misleading here rather than illuminating, but that's not to say those questions aren't going to be relevant as well.
So I think our time is up. I think there's time. It's a quick coffee break now. Is that right? So fascinating session. Just remains me to thank Shelley and Jonas. Thank you very much indeed.